Yes. So before we begin, I want you to hold three images in your mind. A mother stands at the top of a staircase, staring down into the dark of her own home, not because she thinks there's someone out there, but because she started to feel that the danger might be inside her. A hallway stretches too long. A door doesn't just separate inside from outside, it becomes a thin line between safety and threat. And then a body transforms, not into something tragic or cursed, but into something that finally has teeth, a body that refuses to be prey. These are three different stories: the Babadook, Cough, Bit, but they share one structure. They take experiences that are culturally meant to remain private, like maternal rage, gendered vulnerability, queer refusal, and they force them into visibility through horror. And that's where I want to begin today. Horror has never simply been about entertainment. It has never simply been about monsters. It is a genre obsessed with boundaries and bodies. And my argument today is that horror has long been used to police women's bodies, but increasingly in the hands of women and people of marginalized genders, it is being remade into a counter archive, a way of recording not just fear, but the conditions that generate fear, grief, violence, precarity, exclusion, and the everyday labor of survival. So, what I want us to track in this talk is not only what these texts depict, but what they do. How do they reconfigure the Gothic? How do they transform monstrosity from punishment into meaning? And what happens when the monster is no longer the thing outside the door, but the name for a system, a structure, a history that refuses to stay buried? To explore this, I'll use three critical frameworks and three case studies. The three critical frameworks are Barbara Creed's concept of the monstrous feminine, Harrington's concept of gynae horror, Kenitra D. Brooks' book called Searching for Psychoraths, and the three texts we will place into conversations with these frameworks are Jennifer Kent's The Babadook, the Indian web series called Cough, created by Smita Singh, and Brad Michael Elmore's film called Bit. So, to begin with, what is horror? As Kinitra D. Brooks points out, that horror is one of the few genres that is defined not only by its themes or tropes. She writes that defining the genre of horror remains an ongoing challenge, for it is one of the few genres that depends upon the reaction of the viewer or reader. So horror is affective, it is embodied, it is something we feel: fear, disgust, dread, shock, anxiety, panic. Brooks continues, contemporary horror fiction is a space in which deep seated human anxieties can be given free rein because we are often defined by that which terrifies us. Brooks' argument is important here because it allows us to make a theoretical shift. Horror is not merely about entertainment, it is a cultural technology for staging anxieties about bodies and boundaries. And one of the biggest boundary structures horror works with is gender. Brooks argues that Western hegemony depends on binaries, and postmodern horror becomes the space where those binaries can collapse, mutate, or leak. Binaries like good or evil, male or female. And when that collapse happens, it is often framed as terror because the stability of categories is itself a political fantasy. And now that Brooks has set the stage, I'll introduce my theoretical framework in more detail. So, Barbara Creed's The Monstrous Feminine remains one of the foundational texts for feminist horror theory. It identifies how classical horror repeatedly constructs a particular kind of monster, the female monster, not just women who are monsters, but women as monsters. Creed gave us one of the most seminal claims in feminist horror studies that women's objectification is crucial to the functioning of the patriarchal order. This sentence is doing a lot of work here. So, what does it mean? It means that patriarchal power does not only oppress women socially, it also requires symbolic rituals through which women are positioned as contaminating, dirty, excessive, irrational, bodily, and leaky. Horror becomes one of these rituals. Creed explains that horror operates like a modern cleansing ceremony. She writes, as a form of modern defilement rite, the horror film attempts to separate out the symbolic order from all that threatens its stability, particularly the mother and all that her universe signifies. Here, Creed is pulling from Julia Kristeva's concept of abjection. that which must be expelled in order to create the illusion of a stable self. Building on it, Creed describes horror's obsession with policing borders. She writes, the horror film attempts to bring about a confrontation with the abject in an attempt to banish the abject and redraw the boundaries between the human and non human. So, horror, according to Creed, is doing the border work, and abjection is not simply disgust. Creed insists that abjection, by its very nature, is ambiguous, it both repels and attracts, undermining borders and unsettling identities. The abject fascinates. It draws us in precisely because it represents a truth modernity wants us to deny, that bodies are porous, that subjecthood is fragile, and that categories like male, female, human, non human, clean, unclean are constructed. And Creed provides us with a broad psychoanalytical feminist account of monstrous femininity. Taking it a step further, Erin Harrington gives us a more specific vocabulary for how the female reproductive body becomes a horror object. Harrington defines gynae horror as horror that deals with all aspects of female reproductive horror, from virginity and first sex through to pregnancy, birth, and motherhood, and finally to menopause. But what is important is not just the list, it's the politics of it. Harrington says gynae horror exposes how social systems other women. She writes that gynae horror leverages the narrative and aesthetic horrors of the reproductive, the maternal, and the sexual to expose the underpinnings of the social, political, and philosophical othering of women. Thus, horror becomes a lens through which we can see how the woman is culturally reduced to her reproductive anatomy. But Harrington also makes sure to note the limitations of her theorization. She points out that this structural scaffolding is not designed to suggest that this is how all women live their lives or identify with binary gender formations. So, gynae horror gives us tools, but it also invites us to extend these tools beyond cis normative assumptions. And this is crucial when we later turn to bit our third case study. Now, Kinitra Brooks again. Brooks is invaluable here because she gives us a different emphasis. Her emphasis is on haunting, and Brooks uses Sycorax from The Tempest, a figure who is dead before the play begins, absent from the stage, yet constantly invoked as a source of dread and legitimacy. Brooks writes, Sycorax, the island's first inhabitant, is erased, yet Sycorax refuses to be excluded as her absence in erasure is subverted by her presence as an idea that produces fear. Brooks explicitly uses bell hooks when she says, I describe Sycorax's position as an absent presence. This phrase, absent presence, describes what Gothic does. It makes the past return, it makes the suppressed memory become spectral. Brooks continues, Sycorax is present without the need for either a body or a voice. And this is exactly how contemporary horror frequently works through atmosphere, through dread, repetition, residues, objects, and architecture. So at this point, we have three theoretical lenses on the table: Creed, Harrington, and Brooks. But theory can sometimes feel like it's just floating above the text, like something we are applying afterwards. And I want to do the opposite today. Instead of theory as something we add after viewing, I want us to treat theory as a viewing method, almost like a toolkit or set of questions that can train our attention. So here's the bridge. As we move into the case studies, I want you to hold on to three operations horror performs. First is Creed's objection. Creed helps us to see how horror is obsessed with borders, clean and clean, human, non-human, self and the other. Horror returns again and again to the figure of woman, not because she is inherently monstrous, but because patriarchy needs her to be. The second is embodiment. Harrington gives us a way to focus on what horror does to the reproductive and sexual body, but the not just pregnancy horror, but the whole logic by which the woman gets reduced to flesh, blood, cycles, and penetrability. This means that we are looking not only at monsters, but what social power does to bodies. And the third is Brooks' idea of haunting, which reminds us that horror is also an archive of what cannot be spoken, and haunting is not just supernatural, it is what happens when a subject is erased from official narrative. Now, why do these matter for our case studies? The contemporary texts that we are turning to today are not just repeating the older Gothic patterns, they are intervening in them. They are taking the very materials through which horror traditionally controlled women and turning them into narrative resources for survival. And that's what I mean by horror as a counter archive. Not simply the representation of fear, but the preservation of what culture tries to forget. So I'll begin with The Babadook, the first case study. The Babadook follows Amelia, a single mother who is exhausted, grieving, and struggling to care for her young son Samuel after her husband died. One night, a disturbing pop-up book appears in their house, and soon a presence starts creeping into their life. But what makes the film unsettling is that the monster feels as much like grief, depression, and maternal burnout as it does something supernatural. So I'll play the trailer so everybody can get like the small gist of what is going on in the film.
Where'd you get this?
On the shelf.
If it's in a word or it's in a look, you can't get rid of the Babadook. A rumbling sound, then 3 sharp knocks.
Ba-ba-ba-duk, duk, duk.
That's when you'll know he's around. You'll see him if you look. Nothing bad's gonna happen, Sam.
Did you think that about my dad before he died?
He sees things as they are, that one.
I promised to protect you if you promised to protect me.
Oh my God. Did he hurt anyone?
The boy has significant behavioral problems.
This monster thing has got to stop, all right? It's just a book. It can't hurt you.
You all right?
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
You don't have to be fine, you know.
Just a bit stressed at the moment.
All children see monsters.
Not like this. I want to report someone stalking me and my child.
You can't get rid of the Babadook.
You can bring me the boy. You can bring me the boy. You can bring me the boy.
What do you want? You're trespassing in my house!
I'm sick, Sam. I need help. It isn't real. It isn't real. It isn't real.
Right. So it seems to be a haunted house story, a mother and child terrorized by a monster from a pop-up book. But this is also a film about grief and about the unbearable contradictions of motherhood. Creed argues that horror often constructs the maternal figure as monstrous, especially when she is imagined as refusing separation. She writes, by refusing to relinquish her hold on her child, she prevents it from taking up its proper place in relation to the symbolic. And this is a perfect lens for the Babadook because the mother, Amelia, is not simply evil. She is exhausted, traumatized, and isolated. Her husband died while driving her to the hospital to give birth, so motherhood for her is literally born out of death. And we can read Babadook as what Brooks would call an absent presence, because the dead husband keeps returning as dread, as pressure, and as psychic residue. And the film stages motherhood as abjection. The maternal body becomes a site of conflicting desires, and Amelia's body becomes the battleground of love and resentment, care and rage, protection and suffocation. She is not allowed the social privilege of maternal ambivalence. Instead, her ambivalence becomes monstrous. And the book, with its monster, enters the house as an object that does not have a clear origin. Amelia tries to destroy it, but it returns, rewritten, continuing its narrative. You can see the picture on the slide. This is when Amelia tries to burn the book. So the book behaves like trauma, not something that you can neatly externalize or discard. It returns with modifications, repeating the demand that you acknowledge it. What the film makes terrifying is not merely the Babadook as a creature, it is the idea that narrative itself is a kind of haunting. The Gothic here is textual, and the monster is an archive that cannot be sealed. As Brooks reminds us, The haunting does not require a body. Psychorax is present without the need for either a body or a voice. In Babadook, the book is precisely that, a bodiless presence, a voice without an origin. Creed's subjection logic explains why the return feels contaminating. The Babadook produces an encounter with the abject, which is not expellable, not containable, and not containable, and which is returning to redraw boundaries. The mother's identity in the film is destabilized, and motherhood, which should signify stability and care, becomes the site of her dread. The book becomes the mechanism by which grief enters the domestic space as Gothic text. And the Babadook itself is interesting as a monster. It is barely seen, it functions more like an intrusive thought than like a demon. And the key is the ending. Amelia doesn't kill the monster, she contains it, she feeds it, and this corresponds directly to Creed's observation that separating out the mother and her universe from the symbolic order is not an easy task. Perhaps it is finally not even possible. The monster cannot be expelled because it is not alien. It is a part of psychic and social economy of motherhood under patriarchal capitalism. The ending refuses purification, it refuses the defilement ritual. Instead, the film gives us a feminist alternative that is living with grief without pretending it disappears. That is part of what Creed later calls radical abjection, where she argues that women can reclaim what was used against them. Creed writes that what was once abjected in classic horror is now embraced as a source of strength. And this is exactly what Amelia does. She does not become clean and proper, she becomes survivable. And this ending breaks with the classic horror purification structure, where horror usually restores the symbolic order by expelling the abject. The Babadook refuses this and instead it insists on a feminist truth that trauma doesn't vanish, grief doesn't resolve cleanly, and motherhood does not become effortless again. So now we'll move to our second case study, which is Cough. So Cough centers on a young woman who moves into what should be a safe women's hostel, hoping for independence and a fresh start, but the building begins to feel intensely unsafe, almost predatory, as fear spreads through the corridors, rooms, and everyday routines. The horror constantly blurs the supernatural with the social, showing how women's lives are shaped by constant threat, surveillance, and the haunting aftermath of violence. I'll play the trailer again.
So, Madhuri, what brings you to Delhi?
I want to learn. I want to be free.
Free?
Free to be myself.
मुझे तो तुम्हारे बजट में कुछ नहीं मिला, बट नकुल को एक जगह मिली है।
एक नई लड़की उस कमरे में रहने आ रही है। I don't want any nonsense, okay?
It's about to start again. तो निकल लो फटाफट।
Leave.
तुझे रहती थी ना उस कमरे में पहले, निकल नहीं पाई।
दरवाजा क्यों पीट रहे हो तुम लोग?
It's coming from your room. अभी तो शुरू भी नहीं हुआ, और जब होगा ना तो भाग भी नहीं पाओगी।
ऑड ना कि ये लड़कियां कभी भी हॉस्टल से बाहर नहीं निकलती हैं।
हॉस्टल का गेट भी क्रॉस नहीं करती है।
उसे बुला ले ग्रेसी यहाँ। डॉक्टर बुलाते हैं लोग उसे।
एक वो दुनिया है जो आप देख सकते हैं और एक वो दुनिया है जो मैं महसूस कर सकता हूँ। एक बेचैन भूख रहती है यहाँ, तकलीफ देने आई है।
डर कब महसूस करती हो?
जब मैं अकेली होती हूँ, जैसे मेरे हॉस्टल में, मेरे रूम में।
आप बहादुर हैं।
क्या किया है तुमने उसके साथ?
कहा था ना चली जाओ, देर कर दी तुमने।
I want to bring Brooks back in. Uh, she writes, contemporary horror fiction is a space in which deep-seated human anxieties can be given free rein. So in Khof, the deep-seated anxiety is what does it mean for a woman to occupy space without protection? What happens when safety is promised but structurally impossible? And this is where Brooks' idea of absent presence becomes incredibly powerful because violence is often culturally managed through silencing in Khoff's setting. Victims are disbelieved, trauma is normalized, and institutions do not hold perpetrators accountable. So violence returns as haunting. Brooks writes, Psychorax's corporeal death has magnified her subversive presence, haunting multiple plot points. And this is exactly the logic of Khof. Harm persists after the event is done. It becomes architectural. It lives in walls, in nights, in dread. The show, the show basically has it features sustained, repeated emphasis on corridors, door frames, stairwells, spaces between rooms, as you can see in the pictures on the slide. So in Gothic tradition, thresholds are where identity becomes unstable. But here, the threshold is not only supernatural; it is social. It dramatizes how women's safety is always conditional. And Creed's border logic is perfectly applicable here, as horror redraws boundaries between the human and non-human. In Cobb, the non-human is not necessarily demon. It is the system, men, landlords, police, neighbors, stalkers. The corridor is where the woman ceases to be treated as a full subject. She becomes a body. And the anxiety is also spatial. It asks, what does it mean to inhabit a world where the space outside your door becomes predatory? The corridor is the monster's true body, a Gothic architecture that stages women's precarity, and similarly, the room, which is supposed to provide with safe domesticity, it provides suffocation. It traps, it witnesses, and it suffocates. And this is one of the most central Gothic reversal. Home becomes unhomely, but Khof pushes it into political horror. A domestic becomes the site where gendered violence returns as residue, and the haunting can be read as the return of violence that society refuses to archive properly, and trauma becomes the only archive that persists. Creed's border cleanliness framing is also useful here. She writes that horror films construct a border between the clean and proper body and the abject body. The show demonstrates that women's bodies are made socially abject by suspicion and blame as she becomes marked as unsafe, unclean, and exposed. Interestingly, Khof stages the true Gothic horror of gendered life because there is no stable inside. Women's bodies are become abject through gaze of surveillance, harassment, and coercion. And the abject is not merely bodily fluids or monstrosity; it is the social discourse that marks some bodies as viable. Koff makes clear that sexuality is not romance; it is threat, it is power, and the Gothic here is not about the thrill of seduction; it is about the coercion embedded in everyday life. And in traditional Gothic romance, danger is eroticized, but Khof refuses eroticization. It makes danger banal, systemic, omnipresent, more social, and immediate. The third case study is about this film by Brad Michael Elmore. It's called Bit. And in Bit, a trans teenage girl moves to Los Angeles and ends up connecting with a small group of feminist vampires who treat vampirism less like a curse and more like a form of power and solidarity. And when she's pulled into their world, the film flips the traditional vampire story. Instead of a male predator and a helpless victim, we get chosen family, queer community, and the idea that monstrosity can be a way of surviving and fighting back. So tonally, it's very different from the two works, and I'll let the trailer play so that you can see it as well.
You know those teen vampire movies that feel like the horny soap opera fever dreams of an 8th grade diary? Here's how mine began.
The graduating class of Central Oregon High.
Be safe. Oh my God, guys, I'm gonna be fine. My first night in LA, and it's already the best night of my life.
Hi, we're going to after hours party if you want to come.
That's enough. Shoveled a lot in your life, haven't you? How would you like to hold the keys to the kingdom for a change? Now would be the time for any questions.
Were you guys like
Vampires?
Yup. Do you guys kill people?
Indiscriminately.
Innocent people?
It's like 80-20. Rule number one, never turn a man into a vampire. Men can't handle power. Welcome to Fight Club.
Fight Club? What about Bit Girls?
Sounds like we're part of STEM or something. Welcome home.
What, no coffin?
Why would we do that?
'Cause it's dope.
You're staying away from drugs, right?
Yes, Mom. My life's a horror movie. Life's full of things you never think should happen, and then it does. I'm going to be 18 forever.
People just think you're aging well.
You know those teen
Wow, it's really cool. I really love this film. So Bit is about reclaiming monstrosity as community and power, and this is where Creed's concept of radical objection becomes most relevant. He writes, radical objection signifies what takes place when when the woman realizes that her so-called objection is a myth and turns these roles around in an act of defiance and revolt. Bit is structured around this. Vampirism is not infection as tragedy, but infection as recruitment. It becomes a mode of queer affiliation. So this is the scene where the feminist vampires are pitching to Laurel to join to join their group. And if you cannot read the text on the slide, it basically says the word is a meat grinder kid. We are politically, socially, and mythologically fucked. Our bodies, our body is suspect, alien, and other, and we are made to be monsters. So let us be monsters. The turning, that is the biting. The biting is oh yeah, the turning. The protagonist becomes vampire after the turning episode. So turning is basically the where the vampire just bites, and it is make reframes queer biting as queer rewriting of penetration. Classic vampire narratives frame the bite through heterosexual penetration myths, feminine victim, masculine predator, and contamination as moral punishment, but Bit queers this entirely. The bite becomes a counter script. It is not the mark of victimhood, it becomes the beginning of agency. The horror aesthetic remains, but the ideology flips. Monstrosity becomes survival, and Bit rewrites the sexual politics of vampire horror because transformation here is not punishment, it is liberation. And Creed gives us a striking description. The monstrous feminine is a powerfully othered hybrid figure, a terrorist whose aim is to undermine or destroy the oppressive, exclusionary patriarchal order. Funnily, at one point, the group says that at best they can be called a terrorist organization. So great overlap with theory there. But it is all the film is also about insurgency. Vampirism becomes a counter violence, and the refusal to be a prey to predatory men. The vampires in Bit make visible what Brooks says about postmodern horror, that postmodern horror is a world of absolute blurring of boundaries where the universal subject deteriorates. And this is exactly what Bit does. It erodes the universal subject by centering queer and trans bodies as protagonists, not victims. And the vampire group functions as chosen kinship with rules, protection, and purpose. The group is anti universalist, it is local, it is embodied, it is insurgent, and Creed frames the monstrous feminine as hybrid insurgency, a powerfully othered hybrid figure whose aim is to undermine the patriarchal order. And this maps very cleanly onto the film as vampirism becomes gender insurgency and chosen kinship becomes counter archive. And rather than the romantic coupledom of Gothic romance, we get political collectivity and Gothic refusal in Bit. So the Gothic romance is rewritten here, and instead of romantic danger leading to marriage, you get the dangerous desire producing counter community. Now I want to return to the talk's central thesis that horror has been reconfigured into a counter archive of fear, survival, and refusal. So what does this mean now? An archive is usually thought of as authoritative memory, but archives are political. They decide what is preserved, named, catalogued, and legitimized. Horror becomes a counter archive because it records what official discourse refuses to hold: maternal rage, grief, social terror, sexual violence, queer desire, and gendered precarity. These case studies demonstrate that horror is not sim- that it is these case studies demonstrate that horror can it is not simply the fact that horror can accommodate feminist, queer, or trans content. They show us that horror is one of the few narrative forms capable of telling the truth without gendered life about gendered life without making it respectable. If the Gothic has historically been the genre of the disavowed, the locked room, the unspeakable secret, the family curse, and the return of the past, then these texts push that logic into the contemporary moment. They reveal how the secret is not just psychological or supernatural, it is political, it is structural, it is social, and it is gendered. Because in Babadook, the monster is not the alien invader that interrupts domestic life, it is what domestic life generates when it becomes unlivable for women. The film insists that there are effects attached to motherhood that culture refuses to archive, effects like rage, resentment, emptiness, numbness. It uses horror not to sensationalize these effects, but to make them visible without moral correction. The ending of the film is again key here because instead of conquest, we get management, instead of closure, we get ongoingness, and that refusal of exorcism becomes its own politics. It rejects the fantasy that normality can be restored without reckoning with what produced the horror in the first place. And Koff turns this further outward. Here, horror is not primarily psychic, it is spatial and social. It takes one of the most recognizable Gothic motifs, the haunted architecture, and makes it legible as a contemporary condition. Women living inside structures that promise safety but are built on vulnerability. And that is what makes the series so politically Gothic. It uses the supernatural to dramatize a truth that realism cannot hold without becoming didactic. It returns not only as trauma but as atmosphere. Gendered violence, okay, sorry. Yeah, realism often cannot hold without becoming didactic. That gendered violence has an afterlife. It reminds us that gendered violence has an afterlife. It returns not only as trauma but as atmosphere, as routine, as anticipation, as the perpetual sense that danger might arrive any moment. The haunted house becomes a model of how patriarchy works, not only through direct violence, but through the slow production of fear as a way of organizing women's mobility, desire, and independence. And finally, then Bit offers the most radical generic twist of the three. It takes a figure that has historically functioned as Gothic punishment, the vampire, and retools it as a form of collective survival. Instead of monstrosity marking the protagonist as socially disposable, it becomes the condition of belonging. And the film doesn't merely add queer or trans character to a vampire narrative, it changes what the vampire narrative is for. And Gothic desire ceases to be a heterosexual danger game and becomes a queer politics of affiliation, retaliation, and world making. So when we read these texts together, we can see a coherent movement. Horror becomes a genre of counter knowledge. It archives what official narratives disqualify, the mother's ambivalence, the tenant's dread, and the queer body's refusal to be legible on normative terms. And importantly, it archives them as horror, not as therapeutic confession or social realism. And that matters because the Gothic is not simply a container for content, it is a method. It shows us how power produces fear and how fear produces subjects. So, to conclude, I'll reiterate my central claim. When women when women and marginalized genders make horror, monstrosity stops being a warning. It becomes an archive of fear, survival, and refusal. And perhaps the most gothic, most unsettling thing about that is once you recognize the monster as structural, you realize that there is nothing to exorcise, only something to change. Thank you.